Since releasing the initial video, I've received many comments from others expressing their thoughts on Stories of Sodor Season 5, and I figured it'd be a good time to make a more in-depth approach to what went wrong with this season and why it sucked so bad, especially with some of the colorful defenses some have come up with. Today, I'm here to talk in depth about the faults of Season 5. Before I begin, I would like to preface that this will only focus on the Stories of Sodor aspect of Victor Chanzig, and I will not be going in depth about him as a person. I'm sure others will do that someday, but I neither have the time nor energy to play armchair psychologist. But as a side note, Victor, if you are watching this, please cut it out with the edgy humor. You've really pushed your limit with what you can get away with. Without further ado, let's begin. Season 5 begins where Season 4 left off. Sort of. In Season 4, the Little Western branch has been completed, and we get several characters added to the Fat Controller's Railway, including a few returnees. Mainly Peter. Remember? He exists. He was charged with war crimes and stuff. Said, fuck Germany and all its people back in Season 3. When I asked around, this is where about a lot of people started falling off with the series. But I digress. Also in that season, we got historical world building with British railways evolving into dieselization and the modernization plan, and also learning about competition with other mediums of transport, mainly aviation. So, you'd think we'd have a lot of story ideas to work with, and to make them good. Hell, I'd also say Season 4 was one of the best seasons of Stories of Sodor, mainly because of how well it did the world building and how amazing several of the stories were. Those shall be touched upon later in this video. Season 5 opens with mentioning in the teaser that the main catalyst for this season is a giant revenge plot during some of Sodor's dark times. Along with some other potentially great story elements. Or you'd think. The episodes are Vandalism, Competition, Enthusiasts, Rescued, Preservation, Training, Experiment, Revenge, Munitions, Fallout. Let's discuss what went wrong. The first thing to talk about with Season 5 is the pacing. Most notably, there are only 10 episodes in this season, and the longest was 16.5 minutes. If you were to cut out the intro and outro for several episodes, you'd end up with episodes that are less than 10 minutes. Not exactly an unusual thing for a fan series, but the problem becomes evident when you realize what kind of tone is trying to be set from the very beginning. In the first episode, titled Vandalism, it's mostly harmless enough with a police strike causing crime to skyrocket. It's a fairly innocuous plot, and a decent one at that. A real-life issue faced even today, and that's good. We are also introduced to a character named Mr. Robert Hall, the new chief mechanic at Croven's Gate Works. He's the catalyst for this season's mystery, where he mentions his father was a guard for the LMS and was on a goods train pulled by Donald, to which the latter doesn't remember the name. This lingers in his mind. This is good for the audience to begin a mystery. Start small, but grow it into something bigger. At the end of the episode, the Vandals strike the turntable at Knapford and trap all the mainline engines in their berths, except Jeffrey, who offers to take the Flying Kipper in Henry's place, given, the circumstances. He does so, but at the bottom of Gordon's Hill, there's debris on the track. Because he's going track speed and descending on the hill, he's going too fast to stop and derails in a violent crash. And dies as a result. Pausing here, I've seen people criticize Jeffrey's death saying it was goofy, how the hell did he die from nothing, and how did a single pipe derail him, and all that. All valid questions to ask, and my personal answer to the third one is that if it's big or thick enough, given how big a steam locomotive's wheels are, it's relatively easy to derail them with a sizable object. One example I can think of off the top of my head is a Conrail train that was derailed by a shopping cart, as seen on screen right now. As for the second criticism, I have to somewhat agree with that, as later on, Henry derails in a very similar manner and survives. What I would have done different is place more rocks on the route, or make it more obvious he suffered some kind of major damage to kill him. Maybe a giant rock inside his boiler or on his forehead? That'd at least make it a little more obvious. Regardless, Jeffrey is the first to die in this season, and obviously our characters are affected by this before the ending monologue. It's also here that we learned that the crash was intentional sabotage, but by whom is unknown, but hinted at it was none of the Vandals. As the episode ends, we learn the strike finally ends, and the true culprit was only just beginning. And we get a zoom out on a figure that appears to be Robert Hall. Now, I'd honestly say that's a great way to begin a mystery this season. It leaves the audience questioning if this new character is quite the charmer he appears to be. I'd say the short runtime is forgivable in this instance because it's an establisher to get the ball rolling. Short and sweet and all that. But in the next episode, Competition, we seemingly forget all that and move on to talking about roads and the spat between the Little Western and three vehicles. George, Bulgy, or Rupert, and some OC named Lorenzo. Why is his face so crooked? Jeffrey's death is only briefly mentioned, and none of our characters seem affected by it at all. Like, whatsoever. So are we just going to forget he died? Any emotional pact we have for him? Nothing? Okay. At the end of that episode, we rush through everything and just touch on what happened to all three. George was moved to the mainland UK, Bulgy seemingly became a henhouse, I guess, though it's never outright confirmed. And then Lorenzo learned sense, but we never see that character growth happen or any development to make him see sense. Okay? And the problem is, it keeps repeating this formula over and over again. It becomes a disjointed mess where we get no breathing room to take in what happened in the previous episode, and the characters seem genuinely unaffected by it in the long run. We jump from story to story with nothing in between, rushing to the next plot beat to advance it, and absolutely nothing to ruminate on from the previous episode. This is the same problem that Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker had. Absolutely no breathing room to let anything sink, save for the week-long break between episodes. And no, that is not a valid breather. One of my favorite sayings I was taught when writing was, show, don't tell. Essentially, that means to let the audience see something with their own eyes and let them draw conclusions instead of outright telling them.
This is the checkout, where all the food is paid for.
As a small example, instead of explicitly saying, it was a dark and stormy night, showing this idea would perhaps include several shots of rain, lightning, and wind blowing in the trees. Now, isn't that more effective for a visual narrative? And perhaps, to follow that up, instead of saying, our main character was scared, show the audience the character's face with a terrified expression. Again, more effective. Remember that your audience isn't dumb, and they can still see what's happening on screen. With Thomas the Tank Engine, it's a little bit more different than that due to the nature of how it's presented. It's a storybook adaptation, and as a result, has many actions described from the source material. With how it worked for Thomas can be described by friend and fellow writer Ryan Loebner. The original show, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, is perhaps magical in that there is a very distinguished, noticeable atmosphere. This is in part due to a myriad of aspects coming together, similar to an ensemble piece, rather than an individualistic middle school talent show, so to say. Meticulous models in conjunction with sweeping camera work complement the, in earnest, rather basic narration. This is also heightened by choice music compositions. Flying Kipper serves as an excellent example.
Henry was ready at 5 o'clock. There was snow and frost. Men hustled and shouted, loading the vans with crates of fish. The last door banged, the guard showed his green lamp. The Flying Kipper was ready to go. Come on, don't be silly, puffed Henry to the vans. The vans shuddered and groaned, trock, trick, all right.
A cool layer of ice and frost coat the dockside set used, with moody lighting interrupted by only Henry's classification lamps and the red light of the brake van. He rides through the dawn of Sodor with beautifully painted murals of the sun reflecting on the clouds. Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell's score adds to the sense of majestic adventure. What we see is very simplistic narration, highlighted by choice aspects in other fields. In other words, it utilizes the telling to further encapsulate the visuals. Perhaps as if it was through the eyes of a child recreating the events of the books. You ever notice how the figurines never move? But it still remains lifelike and realistic to make it believable. Of course, that aspect is only marginally applicable to Stories of Sodor, given the different nature of the series and the different medium used. But it still occasionally incorporates elements of show don't tell. One of the most notable examples in this series is of certain plot beats in various episodes. Instead of outright dialogue, we just see facial reactions and hints of conversation combined with whatever event is currently going on. But we as the audience can still judge what the characters are feeling based on their expressions. And that's a good thing, especially if there's a particularly tense moment and we're left guessing what's being discussed. Then when the reveal happens, it can pack quite a powerful punch. There are a few good moments here and there in this season, and especially in previous seasons, where Victor does this well, at least in my opinion. But the problem with this lies with how much he relies on it. Remember the shorter runtime of the episodes? The lack of dialogue becomes a negative in keeping engagement, almost as if we're just watching long montages for a majority of the episode. If the episodes were longer, then maybe this wouldn't be much of an issue. Just compare it to last season and its longer runtimes. But combined with the extremely poor or fast pacing, we have nothing to really stick to, save for immediately after. It also creates even more weird pacing issues, and it all boils down to montage the series. This isn't the Mohawk that wouldn't quit. We're not here for that. We're here for talking trains with faces. And as far as I can see, they haven't exactly talked that much. As one comment points it out, Victor got away with doing it so much because the older episodes were longer and more drawn out and methodical. If you really look into it, he did the show don't tell as much as he used to in prior series. But because the episodes are so much more fast-paced and shorter, sometimes it seems to take up half the runtime. The key takeaway is this. Show, don't tell is a good example to follow, but you still need to tell your audience some details, because imagination can only stretch so far and fill in so many blanks. I believe this is what also makes Jeffrey's death a key issue with many. But more on that later. One of the biggest things that Victor relies on for Season 5's engagement value is character deaths. And that is usually an effective way to keep your audience engaged, or to subvert their expectations. You're going to have character deaths be engaging, shocking, and effective. It happens all the time in media, and is a tried and true method for great storytelling. But as Twitter will tell you, the deaths in this series are lackluster, ineffective, goofy, and on some occasions, laughable. Why is that? Let's go through each death in order and examine why each one has problems. At least, the ones I could find reasons for. Jeffrey. This one was mentioned already, but the lack of details on his death. Why did this wreck kill him and not Henry, who suffers an almost one-to-one wreck later on? What part of the impact killed him? Plot convenience? And we only get a literal 22 seconds of reaction. Barely any reaction and no impact on future episodes. One pointed out that you could take that death out, and it wouldn't matter in the grand scheme of things. It just happens and ends up being completely unnecessary. It does in the conflict of that episode's plot at least, but since it's also part of the bigger mystery, you need to have it make a bigger impact overall. Avery Halifax. I don't have much gripe with this one. He's a character we've never seen before, never been relevant in any previous story. We get all the information we need in the same episode. He's basically a foamer who trespasses on property to get his pictures, and through his own hubris can abuse the justice system to keep doing it, even at the expense of his own safety. He later dies as a result of just that. Honestly, I'd say this death isn't too much of an offender, and is a good lesson into the episode, and a good reminder for all of us. Actually, his death does have an unintended side effect that helps further the story for one of our characters, and that's a good thing. However, it takes us an entire episode between the event and when it's next brought up before we see any effect. That takes away from any impact it might have had. Also, just like with Jeffrey, Emily seemingly gets over it by the next episodes, despite clearly being affected in that episode. You could argue that this death is pointless, but given it actually has an effect on the island and lasts more than one episode, I'd say that one is slightly more forgivable. If only the rest were just as thought out, but more on that later. Patrick Clifton. Honestly, even typing this out, I have no idea what to say for this one. It feels out of place, and that sucks because I thought it was well done. I mean, save for the fact it's saying we killed Postman Pat. Man. Regardless, the story idea is good, really good, I'd say, and if you were to isolate it from everything else, the main plot, everything, then it'd really be able to stand out on its own. There was a comment on the episode before it was marked as made for kids automatically by YouTube, god damn it, which said that it felt like the whole Smokebox Syndrome plot beat felt rushed, shocker, and completely glossed over. And I have to agree. I do like how it was slightly foreshadowed in the previous episode, but it was only for a few seconds, and it doesn't have enough time to really sink in or make your audience think. As a result, the whole thing with Pat feels just shoehorned in. You could also cut this one out, and it would have no real impact on the season's main plotline. Again, it's a shame because I thought this was an actually good one, and I felt some emotion. I await to be lynched now. Peter. I only have 2 words for this. God damn it. God damn it! This one could have been so much more impactful. Hell, it could have been more of an impact to the plot as a whole. I don't even need to put it in my own words. I'll let the comments speak for themselves. Quote, "My bigger gripe is Peter's death. Now, I'm not saying him dying couldn't work, but the way it was handled was very poor. Peter barely got any screen time after he returned from Railgate, he didn't undergo a character arc, and all he did was move around and whine and self-pity, and then all of a sudden this guy we've never seen before and was barely mentioned in passing shows up out of nowhere and kills him, and he doesn't even speak a single word of dialogue. It just felt like such a waste to bring Peter back, have him do absolutely nothing, and then just kill him out of nowhere." Unquote. And, quote, "Peter could have been killed during the harbor scene, after which being hailed as heroes of the hour is then murdered by the German visitor. It would have had more impact as it would have been more understanding and would have punched us, the audience, in the guts as his arc on showing he was more than his past." Unquote. Now, wouldn't have that been so much better? I've also seen people note that shooting his firebox shouldn't kill him or make his entire boiler rupture, which, honestly, yeah, is fair. Even with the metal fatigue explanation, it's too much of a stretch. Hall Twins' mother. Don't even remember her name if she had one, but I really had no gripes about this one. At least her death made sense and actually does have a bigger impact, being part of the reason this whole season is happening anyway. I can't complain about this one too much. It's fine and inoffensive to the story, to say the least. Mr. Nigel Zorro. This one was fine too, relatively speaking. It makes sense in the context of the bigger plot line. We've had his character arcs, and we had one final moment with him, and the seemingly main villain guy person thing. We even got to expand on some past events too with him. The model for him is old, but that's just trains. I can look past that, having filmed in that unoptimized piece of garbage myself for many years. Whatever. I only wish, just like the rest of these deaths, it had more of an impact than, oh no! Anyway, Benson. We had absolutely no time this season to expand on him. In fact, he was essentially how that one Twitter user put it in the meme I saw posted in a server. Other than that, let's talk about actual character assassination. We have established he's a hardcore military engine who does things by the book and whatnot. He has over 50 years of experience, so how is it that he makes one of the most rookie of mistakes? And being impatient, and dangerous for that matter. This is where I believe Victor made a mistake in trying to keep to the original Tug script, which also makes no sense since he slightly modified them before, key evidence being choices here. You're adapting a series about ships into a series about trains. You have the creative freedom at your disposal, and you fumbled it to be the most anticlimactic and botched way possible. It would have been better if we got more time with Benson to actually care about him, but no. He just existed to die and be a brief scapegoat that no one even cares about. Oh, and all the dock workers might have not existed as well. Thomas. You know, I'm not totally against killing off a main character. It happens all the time in media. But the problem is that the execution, no pun intended, has to be worth it. Thomas does what Tencent basically did in Munitions, except when the tanker explodes, Thomas is horrifically injured. Like, half of his face is fucking gone. Truth be told, in universe, that's pretty morbid to think about. And the fact he lived initially? That unnerved me genuinely. Of course, it's ruined because of the freaking anti-aliased MS Paint spray tool. People on Twitter and Discord joke about it basically being emo hair, but whatever, not relevant to this. Thomas isn't just our main character, he is the main character, the one we've been following through thick and thin for 5 fucking seasons. So we have a lot to feel with him. Or we should. Problem is, literally everyone guessed he would die just from the previews alone. So to see his death confirmed, no one was surprised. Except for the fanboys in denial, but I digress. So that's 2 different aspects to ruin Thomas's arguably biggest moment in this entire series. The third one is the most insulting. No one cares. We get nothing from the characters, not even one word from his best friend. Not even his funeral was anything special. Benson, fucking Benson, got more time on his death than your lead character. And that was them despising and disrespecting his death. What the fuck? Rest in fucking peace, Thomas. You died for nothing. Mickey. His death was just a crappy copy of Lily and Henry. Get over it. Except it somehow has even less impact. Remember when Lily died? Douglas despised Henry for half a season, which led to him eventually lashing out, and it took him a while to forgive him, despite it not being his fault? And that was from season 3, which was 4 years ago. 4! Oh, and dare I mention that the only mention of his death from anyone is Donald and Derek happily smiling and saying he was a good man, and so was Thomas, in a random passing conversation, which was then immediately overshadowed by the main plotline? That's it. Another series-long character with no reaction whatsoever. The only saving grace is that at least it's in character for Mickey to sacrifice himself to save another engine. Well done, you got one thing right out of 4. Sean Hall. The only truly good death, honestly. I love how his arc rounded up. He did it. He completed his revenge, he accomplished what he set out to do, except maybe kill Henry, and now he has nothing left to do. He breaks into his childhood home, takes one final look at the traumatic memories around him, and kills himself. As Edward puts it, and that was it. No justice, no retribution. Honestly, I love stories like that where the main villain wins. And the fact he would give no one satisfaction for his capture, that is how you end a dark, grim season. Is what I would say if the ending wasn't botched. But we'll cover that in the next point. Overall, this one was fine enough, all things considered. The main issue with all of these deaths, though, is that the consequences of them don't really sink in, and we as the audience are just thrust to the next story and the next plot beat without a care or a whim. Again, the abysmal pacing. But on to the next point, the problem with consequences. Stakes are built on cause and effect. If there's no effect to the cause, then you don't have stakes. That's what I said in the original video. Let's elaborate on that with specific points. As mentioned, each character's death feels cheap and seems to only exist to try and set a dark tone. Some of these deaths, as I already mentioned, probably weren't meant to be cheap audience shockers, but because we get almost nothing out of the characters except 1 or 2 lines of dialogue relating to them, we get no reason to care beyond that point. As a result, they feel unnecessary. If the deaths and our other characters' reactions and emotions permeated into more than one episode, then we'd really be able to begin caring, because it's actually affecting them. If it doesn't affect your characters, then why should we as an audience care if they don't? The pacing of the episodes doesn't help either, as if it wasn't rushed enough, there's literally no time to even feel anything for the characters, or even any consequences related to non-death actions. Again, the week-long wait time between episodes does not count. I see comments from others saying they cried at whoever's deaths, and all I can say is, how? The major final twist at the end of the season with Mr. Hall's brother seems to be the only real consequence for anything, given it's the main plotline. But the twist really falls flat since a majority of people guessed early on it was his brother and not actually him. I was expecting Fallout, the last episode in this season, with the title that literally means the adverse side effects or results of a situation. So you would think that everything that has happened in the last 9 episodes would all circle back to this final episode. But no, it just doesn't. All we get, like I said, is, oh, character and character were good people. The changing nature of the industry meant things would get better, and then we get our happy Tugs ending. Kick me in the face. If the ending isn't sad, then why should we be sad? Let's discuss something else now. The character arcs in this season are practically non-existent. Almost no one really grows or develops, and the same can really be said about the episodes as a whole. It tries to focus on the bigger storyline of Sean Hall's revenge, but the problem with that is that there's too much padding and filler in between. If you were to take out the episodes Competition, Enthusiasts, Preservation, Training, and Experiment, absolutely nothing would change or affect the main overarching revenge plotline. And that's half the season right there. When half of your season is just filler episodes in context of a bigger story, then that's not good storytelling. Best I can equate that to is watching a horror movie without having a single scare for over 30 minutes. You can maybe have 1 or 2 filler episodes, but they still need to have some relation to the main plotline at hand. Hell, it would have been great if we had our characters still reeling from events of past episodes, wouldn't it? I don't know if it would have made it better, but it still would have been something. And usually, something is better than nothing. Again, the only real saving grace I can give this is the Sodor and Mainland trio retiring, and Thomas and Kate reconciling. Those are the only 2 times I can think of where we get any kind of actual personal growth. Now, I know a lot of people aren't exactly on board with the shipping of trains with faces together. I know I'm not, but apparently some obsessively are. But it was still a good character moment for these two, especially in context of the canon. Since they broke up last season, they've grown, shown remorse for their mistakes, and they end up becoming friends again, talking like old times. That's character development, and good character development at that. If only it wasn't so rushed. As this guy here in my comment section said, the lack of an overarching plot. Almost none of these episodes are connected in any sort of way. And I can't help but agree. How is it we got an amazing character development arc for Duncan last season, and then we go from that to this? There's a lot I could say on that front, but I'll simply leave it on the best example, which is that. I already mentioned that Experiment was my most hated episode of the entire series. Steam to diesel conversion is just flat out ridiculous and should not have been a thing in this series. Many have tried to tell me that it was a real thing and isn't so implausible and blah blah blah. While, yes, it actually happened once in a blue moon, it was absolutely implausible on a large-scale basis like Victor is pushing in this narrative. And for that matter, just makes no sense. Here are some further elaborations made by Stephen Hawley 113 in the comments section, spliced together for clarity. It is, as a concept, was flawed at the time of the Big Four. The Kitson-Stills engine of 1926 proved to the railways that a hybrid of that type just wasn't good enough. It wasn't at all more effective than steam engines of that time. Now maybe in the 1960s, it would have been marginally better, but then why bother when British Rail's going to replace them with various types of Type 2s, 3s, 4s, and 5s they've been getting from the dieselization scheme? A big problem with these kinds of steam-diesel hybrids is that despite the theories of how good this type of system is on paper, they almost always fail to even see some success. Fuel costs in the next 8 years following Experiment are going to skyrocket, and Britain is already and still bountiful with coal. That would, by the 80s, be all but dried up. So why would British Rail pursue a project that they already know isn't going to work? By the time of Season 5, the usage of diesel hydraulic and diesel electric locomotives have already taken swing across most of the world. The BR Western region had adopted diesel hydraulics and all but wiped out their steam by 1965, with the other regions tightening the proverbial noose on steam power until 1968. For Mr. Hall to try and make Barry into something that arguably by the mid-60s would be woefully inadequate is a bit unusual. Furthermore, it would probably be prohibitively expensive to even try to attempt this, given all the work it'd take for something that could do maybe 70% to 80% as good as it would if it would be running on normal coal. Why would BR even allow this, since they would have already known from the Kitson-Stills project that it absolutely could not work or be economical. So the fact that British Rail would adopt this widespread scheme into their programs when they've already failed at everything else, as explained by Victor in Season 4, is ridiculous. I've had some people try and tell me, oh, it only applies to non-faceless vehicles. The law binds them to be kept alive, so it only makes sense. You're complaining about nothing. Alright then, tell us that! Unless it's explicitly stated in the series, then all that is just a dumb fanfiction justification. That's the same logic Star Wars fans use to defend the sequels. Oh, it's canonically mentioned in some obscure book, so boom, your answer is there and you have been defeated. I hate to tell you, but you're supposed to give that main information in the main movie, video, event, whatever itself. Your audience is supposed to have the information, not to find it themselves in something almost seemingly completely unrelated. Hell, Victor has never even said there is a reason in the first place. So, no, that is not the reason. One last thing. Yes, steam engines were converted to burn oil. It happens. It still happens to this day. But they're still steam engines. They still use steam as their power, not a freaking diesel-electric motor. Good God, learn the difference. Speaking of history, however, the part that angers me about this stupid steam-diesel conversion thing is that it has destroyed the world building for the series. Victor has made it clear that despite the non-faceless trains and the supernatural events, this is still set in our reality, or a version close to our reality. If it wasn't, then why go through the trouble of implementing reasons to explain Bruce or Diesel being built in the 1930s, or all the plot beats with British Rails and their various plans to be economically viable, and all the history and knowledge? The fact that Dr. Beeching himself visited the island, Murdoch being the prototype for the 9F, the LNER and LMS stuff? As I briefly mentioned in the original video, the SDC conversion completely defeats the preservation of steam engines and every steam preservation event to come if they can simply be converted to a diesel engine. Wouldn't steam still be used if it was just that simple and effective as Victor claims it to be? And before anyone again makes the whole "it's for non-faceless vehicles" argument, Victor has not confirmed that in the series, so it's not canon. Yet. I hope he doesn't make it canon, but that's the least worst option at this point, and even if he did, what's to stop faceless vehicles from undergoing the same rebuild? The main problem is, as stated above, it was a massive failure and pointless to do so, and wouldn't even be feasible to do on mainline engines under a lot more stress. Actually, steam engine boilers are designed to trap heat. Do you know what diesel engines have problems with, and need to have cooling systems for? Yeah, how does that make sense in any realm? I've also had some tell me, so train cancer you believe, but this is where you draw the line? And the answer is yes, because metal fatigue is a real phenomenon that affects machines of the real world on a near daily basis. It was already explained how it affects non-faceless vehicles differently from faceless vehicles, and it is an established lore fact. It's nothing major and outlandish, but it's a spin on an already existing condition, and a realistic one at that. No conversion from boiling water to burning oil here, just overstressed metal. Last point up for this one. While this doesn't necessarily apply to Season 5, the fact that Thomas is dead is going to present a lot of problems for Victor in the future. If the Railway series is canon in Stories of Sodor, then does that mean it's going to be followed by the TV series? Then the CGI series? How is the world going to react to his death? What about Day Out with Thomas? Are we just gonna get stories about people exploiting his image in some sort of dumb meta-commentary? Please no. Or even worse, is he just gonna retcon Thomas's death? Some people are theorizing this might happen because of Barry Scrapyard and whatnot. In fact, there's a comment on one of the reactions for Fallout where Victor himself says that this isn't the last we've seen of Thomas, so I sincerely hope to God that this isn't what he has planned. If you ask me, that would just be the biggest slap in the face to everyone. Those who criticized Thomas's death, and those who genuinely liked or felt sad or anything for Thomas's death. Especially since he went through the trouble to kill him in the first place. Fake out deaths don't work out well. Look at this video I have on screen for proof. So, fanfiction time. Like Chuck Conroy once said, I'm not a fan of doing rewrites, because nothing ever truly goes to plan with projects as big as these. Nothing is going to ever be perfect. Not everything will be timely or go as expected. It's just a perfect pipe dream. There will always be hiccups. But, in the hopes of highlighting the issues with Season 5, I'll be giving it a go here. Some key rules to follow: we have to unfortunately kill everyone who died in this season, follow the same general plot beats, and somehow make them more effective. There's no way I'm going to appease everyone with these suggestions, but I'll still try my hardest to find any kind of fix. Who knows? Perhaps one could expand on these for their own series, or maybe their own story writing. Let's begin. Episode 1, Vandals. Essentially, have it play out almost the exact same. Honestly, this one was a fine enough opener. 2, Competition. After Jeffrey dies and the bridge is completed, everyone is in a sulky mood, having lost a good friend and ally, and now they have to worry about losing all their freight and passengers to the roads. The two big bad roadies, George and Bulgy, or Rupert, or whatever, make fun of the engines for their misfortune, and use the opportunity to take advantage of their sorrow for their gain. The third roadie, Lorenzo, could be new and pick up their superiority habits, but still be doubtful with his own common sense. Perhaps he could question if George and Bulgy are truly in the right, and maybe, with the help of Bertie, realize they're actually in the wrong. Eventually, it all accumulates when another engine, perhaps Henry due to relevancy, is helping one of the two Great Western engines, but gets involved in a near collision with some road vehicle. Malfunctioning signal, perhaps? Or so it seems. Duck and Oliver have enough, and then Oliver can lash out at George the same way in the original. It's silly, but hey, we need a laugh somewhere. Maybe Lorenzo could warn Bulgy not to use his secret route, but gets ignored, and that could also play out the same. Maybe Lorenzo, hurt having his feelings disregarded, finally revolts against Bulgy and starts lashing out at his superiority complex. Lorenzo is then able to redeem himself in his own character arc, instead of it happening off screen. Perhaps it could span over 2 episodes. And that malfunctioning signal? Tampered with. The culprit to cause Jeffrey's death is still at it, and has much more planned. Everyone is on edge. Episode 3, Enthusiasts. With 2 cases of tampering and 1 engine dead still fresh on their minds, the Fat Controller becomes concerned it may get worse due to the railfan boom after the completion of the bridge. Enthusiasts are everywhere, and they're already beginning to cause more trouble. At this point, it's harder for law enforcement to tell who might be responsible for what, if any of them are. Avery Halifax only adds to their headaches. So, the Fat Controller tells the engines to be careful and diligent, and on the lookout for any trouble. You can then have the rest of the episode play out like it did in the original, except at the end, elaborate why Emily was reprimanded. Why was she, anyway? As well, perhaps Lorenzo redeems himself here as part of that character arc. Maybe by warding off Halifax at some point, even if only temporarily doing so. Maybe before his death, or maybe he prevents him from dying the first time? I don't know. Maybe he even tries to warn him right before he's killed. Whatever. And have it be found that the incident was not caused by the mystery saboteur, but further elaborate that because of it, it's making it harder for the police to find him. This can be reflected on the engine's anger that Jeffrey's killer still hasn't been caught, and their frustration that their possible ace in the hole, the snap coupling of the NCB trucks, had absolutely nothing to do with the sabotages, and it's just completely coincidental. And it puts them all even more on edge. Episode 4, Rescued. While Kate begins to reel from the loss of her home, British Rail begins the wide-scale plan of retiring and scrapping most of their steam engines, or at least have it expand to Sodor. As if everyone wasn't already nervous enough, the sight of thousands of steam engines rusting away and dismantling makes them sick to their boilers. Remember when Adam, before he died, said that non-faceless vehicles don't have a lot of time left? Let's loop back on those fears. The engines begin to all doubt how much longer they have, seeing the empty husks of their fallen brethren. Before they can answer, though, Barry is awakened, and this only heightens everyone's fears of scrap. Kate especially, given she just lost her home, and now she doesn't know if she'll have a future home. Meanwhile, Neil is losing his nerve and racked with guilt. Has he sent another innocent engine to their demise before Barry? He's taken out of service as he's too much of a wreck. As a result, Kate comes in to temporarily help, but she still fears what her future is. But they're interrupted before they can continue as Henry has crashed and needs to be saved. That part can basically play out the same, but Barry's subplot for conversion plays out differently. That'll be touched on later, but in the meantime, it'll take a while for Barry to be completely repaired. Henry's rescue can also play out as it did in the original. In the meantime, it's found that Henry's crash was also the result of sabotage, and the engines are now beyond terrified and confused. The perpetrator is still in the loose and still enacting his plans. Episode 5, Preservation. Axe this episode. Axe the subplot with Smokebox Syndrome 2. I can't find any good place for any of this, and Thomas and Kate's reconciliation can just happen at the scrapyard. If we're not going to do anything with scrap this season, then just don't bother. Though, if we still want to set it up for the next season, just have the Smokebox Syndrome moments play out throughout this season in intermediate periods. Episode 6, Training. Kate finds a new home on the Little Western, and with the support of Thomas and Toby, they're able to train her in her new surroundings. Meanwhile, Mavis arrives, and that can also play out as normal. Though, have her runaway incident first be suspected of intentional foul play, given everything that's happened on the island, but then Percy fesses up it's his fault. So everyone becomes angry at Percy, but then they become complacent and think that perhaps, maybe, they can think that the saboteur has finished enacting whatever he was doing with the railway, though they still mourn the loss of their friend and express frustration how he still hasn't been found. And on top of that, to add to that sadness and frustration, their biggest job of the year, the munitions contract, is about to take full effect, and they're down an engine when they needed him the most. Maybe, with this, the Fat Controller can announce that Benson is going to return to the island to help out and to also oversee the operations. Of course, given their past experiences with Benson, they already know that this is going to be one hell of a job. The culprit takes full notice of this and decides to lie in wait for his next act. Episode 7, Experiment. While that is all happening, Barry's rebuild is completed, and Barry becomes an oil-burning steam engine, and not a diesel engine. His performance is exceptional, but because of the trauma of being in a coma, he overexerts himself and damages himself as a result. It's simple as that. The rest can play out as normal, including Francis's bit. But how about we move his interaction with Peter to this episode, and how about we have Barry also step up to help the others with the munitions contract? And at the very end of this episode, have the saboteur watch as the naval ship Krakatoa docks, and he begins to make his move at the Krasny Kern plant. Episode 8, Munitions. Yeah, we're moving this up a slot. If we absolutely have to stick to the Tugs plotline, have Benson arrive and boss the engines around like normal, but not because he's being an asshole about it, but because he's just trying his best to keep everyone safe. He's heard of the recent incidents on Sodor, and safety is his number one concern. Maybe also elaborate the Krakatoa docked on Sodor despite the recent events because the contract with Krasny Kern was non-negotiable or something? Regardless, if he had to boss Mickey, do it because he becomes too cautious with safety and oversteps his boundaries as a result, maybe telling him to move to a, quote, more safer or more viable position? Whatever. Have him express frustration, give him some character rather than being just trained version of Blue Nose. Maybe he could become some kind of buddy with one of the engines, and they start to appreciate Benson a little bit more. He could still have the others to clash with at the same time, but let's expand on his good side we saw teased in Season 4. Still better than nothing. Yada yada, cut to later that night, and instead of Benson bumping the train out of impatience, he becomes so preoccupied with ensuring everyone else is safe that he has a lapse in his judgment and bumps into the train as a result of not paying attention to himself in his overworrying. But we all know that train he bumps into isn't the one to catch fire. He's taken off guard by this, and before he can really react, bam, he dies. It's probably not the biggest impactful event, but we still give people a reason to feel for Benson. Events can play out as normal, except let's have Peter be here to replace Jeffrey's heavy duties, as mentioned earlier, and he could also do some kind of heroic actions here to redeem himself in the process, and Thomas makes a sacrifice a la the original. To be continued and all that. Episode 9, Revenge. Get ready now. So, the morning after, everything is in shambles. Thomas is mortally wounded, but there's still a slight chance he might be saved. So, he's taken to the works, and they try to repeat the same procedure they did to fix Henry. But while that's happening, they have to do cleanup recovery. As they do, whoever Benson made friends with is sad and then angry because Benson is being blamed for Thomas's accident. And so they justifiably lash out and say they're treating him unfairly. Perhaps this friend is able to knock some sense into the other engines, and as a result, they realize, eventually, he's not the cause of the fire, but they have no leads because any evidence they would have had to the contrary would have been destroyed. This angers everyone to no end, and they begin to lash out at everyone and everything, asking themselves, why is this happening? Who's responsible? As the days pass and no one finds any answers, along with Thomas seemingly not getting any better, the island wants to hold a celebration to those who saved the greater part of the island from disaster. Peter is asked to join, having helped in a very major way. This helps him overcome his previous guilt, but during the celebrations, the said son of one of the war victims arrives and kills him. I should say how he kills him will not be up to me because I don't know weapons, but definitely should be more realistic than a 9mm bullet to the firebox. This spoils the mood big time, and soon everyone is depressed and angry, even more so than before in the episode. They think the guy who killed Peter is the true culprit and was lashing out on the entire island as a result. The events with Robert Hall, Topham Hatt, and Mr. Zora can also play out as normal, as can the whole flashback segment. Mr. Zorro is then shot in cold blood, and now everyone is reeling from the deaths of both Peter and Mr. Zorro. But now, since the person they thought was to blame was in custody when this happened, they're now extremely confused on who it really is. And maybe, just maybe, this can exemplify their fears. Episode 10, Fallout. The cleanup of the harbor continues, and the higher-ups at British Rail are not happy. During the cleanup, one of the workers, while sifting, screws up and a live round ends up detonating. Mickey sacrifices himself by staying behind and pushing Donald mostly out of harm's way, but Donald is still injured. As if that wasn't bad enough, Thomas's procedure ultimately fails, and he dies from his injuries. Everyone gathers to pay their respects to both Mickey and Thomas, with Percy, Kate, Annie, and Clarabelle giving the most heartfelt eulogies and shedding the most tears. The grief becomes too much for some, and they go into a depressive slump. Meanwhile, Douglas is able to piece everything together based on the clues he's obtained throughout the entire season, much like in the original. Confronting Gregory Hall, they eventually realize his brother is the actual culprit, and before they can enact on anything, Sean Hall offs himself, again, much like the original. With no one to get any retribution or any satisfaction from the true culprit, and with many of their friends gone, some express rage and likely destroy something, perhaps slamming a train in frustration. This could end disastrously in a major derailment, perhaps, or perhaps maybe even destruction of something more. At this point, British Rail has had enough, and they get the ball rolling on revoking the engine's rights to life. Make it so they actually already begun to do so a few years ago, but this is the catalyst for convincing Parliament that the non-faceless engines are too costly to handle, and then their rights are revoked. Soon, many will face retirement and scrapping, much to their dismay, horror, and shock. And then the season ends on that bombshell. No satisfaction from any of the engines, and 1965 truly ends as a grim year for Sodor. And that's just one way to help try and fix this season, and how it could have gone. Is it perfect? No, far from. Is what I suggested even any good? Truth be told, I don't know. Because we know that will never happen. I'm a firm believer in you can make anything good with the right execution. And Season 5, as it stands, was simply poorly executed. The best way to describe this season is that it's like a Christopher Audrey book. It constantly bounces around, coming up with interesting ideas, characters, and stories, only for them to see little use, get overshadowed, or misplaced. Friendly_lad. And so, here we are, at the end. A few more minor nitpicks that I couldn't place in this video. Why did Barry's face pack change? Bodies in any sort of explosion, like what happened at the harbor, should be located and removed first before they continue digging. It's a bit unusual that a live bomb somehow passed by the work crews when loading it. If it's detonated at the scrapyard well after being moved, then how did it get set off? The Royal Engineers should have been present to safely remove UXOs, unexploded ordnance, from the harbor side, since by 1965, they would have had at least 20 years since the start of the Blitz of Veteracy. Despite what was revealed in Fallout, Benson shouldn't never have died this way and should have been even more careful. Even if the character is meant to be a no-nonsense officer, how come he is the one to mess up when loading munitions? I understand that it's probably more so to do with complacency, but he always was shown to have people be poignant with their deliveries to the MOD site. The fact that Gregory Hall is let off the hook so easily is somewhat dubious considering, given his relation, he'd also, even despite the alibi, be a major potential suspect. Barry should be no more powerful, if not worse in performance, than he would be originally 7 years prior due to the conversion. Why couldn't have Thomas just thrown the tanker out of the way and then leave? He wasn't even coupled. How would Peter, despite the metal fatigue explanation, manage to expire from 9mm parabellum rounds? You need something larger, like a rifle, to even hope to pierce a boiler. 9mm para-armor piercing would be extremely hard to find in 1960s Britain, if not outright impossible. With that out of the way, what does Victor need to do to make Season 6 any better than this? Well, I don't know. Truth be told, I can't find any way for him to handle Thomas's passing after this. I honestly cannot see any good way to deal with future events in the series, or how he can write off steam to diesel conversion for future fact-checking, as it basically has erased any and all stakes of the engines losing their rights and being scrapped, which was Adam's biggest fear back in Season 4. So, does that mean Adam's own fear is now completely nullified? What would have been the point of him worrying about steam being done for, and worrying how long it would be before it's no longer sustainable to non-faceless vehicles? So many amazing ideas, now completely down the drain. At this point, I can safely say I no longer want anything to do with Stories of Sodor. I hope Victor doesn't retcon everything, because that would just make it all even worse. But at the same time, as I said, I don't know how he plans to continue after this, but it doesn't look good. I just don't see any win here. Even if he is somehow able to bounce back with the series, I've lost all faith I had in it. I know people don't like Victor, and have some very creative names for him everywhere I go. As said in the original video, I know I might be vilified for even liking the series in the first place, even suggesting all the ideas I have. To that, I apologize to all of you. I would also like to apologize to the buried truck, as I feel any future use of Dudley that Victor has planned might be my fault. I did suggest him for potential future stories. However, I didn't suggest he do anything radical of that nature of your fears, though. If anything, it'd be closer to what happens in his main original arc. But still, to Victor, I also apologize. It honestly has come to this, but I do hope you can learn from this experience. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. I hope you all have a Merry Christmas and have a good one.